let's talk about Russia for a second. Russia is and North Korea are well known for doing what's called false flag operations, where they try to do one of these kind of things, where they want us to point the fingers at somebody else and make it really confusing. Something we got to watch out for because, again, the United States in the World Cup is the biggest sporting event in the world. Right up there with the Olympics, something like that. So there are a lot of enemies in the United States that might not have an axe to grind against Iran, but they might use that to embarrass the United States.
I'm Steve Brenner from the US Sun. Today we're speaking to Michael Lebowitz, a security expert on the situation with the Iranian soccer team who are on their way to Mexico. They're going to be based in Tijuana, Mexico, to keep them outside of the United States while they train. Their 3 matches are going to be on the West Coast of the United States, but they're going to be flying in and out. So we decided to speak to Michael to find out what the risks are and what kind of protocols are in place to keep the Iranian soccer team safe as they go to war with the United States. Michael, thanks for taking the time to join us. First up, can you just introduce yourself and just explain your background and your specialities?
Thanks for having me, Steve. My name is Michael Lebowitz. I spent a lot of time as a Guantanamo Bay prosecutor and a national security attorney with the Department of Justice for many years. I've been the chief of national security law at Army Cyber Command. So I have a unique expertise in all things security, counterintelligence, counterterrorism. I'm also a combat veteran. And so if it's anything to do with foreign intelligence or surveillance or cyber or terrorism, I've probably seen it.
I'm sure you have. We're speaking very much from the outside, looking in with the whole Iranian World Cup security situation. But can you kind of just take us behind the scenes, like when and this is obviously a very, very unique situation. No team has competed in the World Cup when they're actually at war with the hosts. But what goes into trying to safeguard a large contingent of people like this, because it's not only just the Iranian soccer team, it's all the people around the team as well and officials and stuff. So how much sort of work is going on in the background to keep these guys safe where they're based in Tijuana, Mexico?
So there is a lot of things going on, both to keep Americans safe as well as keeping the Iranian team safe. This World Cup is of course designated as kind of a high value security thing, kind of like the Super Bowl. But of course, it's all over the country over many days. And the Iranian team, although they're in Tijuana, they're going to be playing in LA and in Seattle. So there are a lot of working groups that are together, intelligence community, working with law enforcement. It's called a whole of government approach, just to make sure that everybody is safe. That again, big part of it is making sure that the Iranian delegation that does come is limited, so that, again, to protect the United States from any issues from the Iranian team that perceive real, but also at the same time protecting them from, whether it's, any kind of conceivable issue that might personally affect the team members. And one thing to look at, of course, there's this historical precedent for attacks against national teams. Whether it's cyber attacks or whether it's physical attacks. The 1972 Munich Games is kind of probably the big one that people kind of look at as we got to stop this, because what they're looking at are the dissident groups that might have an axe to grind against the Iranian team, or they might want to make this kind of a coming out party for whatever group wants to make a statement. So they're going to be looking at them. They're going to be looking at, like kind of the cyber aspects of things to make sure things are shored up. So a lot of that's going to be going on, as well as personal security, not just, at the game itself, but outside the game, and anything that could be maybe not a personal attack physically against the teammates, but there could be some kind of tangential attack, again, which could be cyber, it could be something outside of the gate, kind of maybe in the line, where there are people are queuing up to go to the game. And then, of course, there's you got to look at the fans, there who are supporting the Iranian team, who's, not supporting the Iranian team. And I'm not talking about like FIFA will handle like the signs or whatever political protests they want. But as far as security goes, they have to really look at the surveillance. The surveillance, I'm sure, is bumped up, and that's electronic surveillance, human intelligence, that kind of thing.
Is it a good move to have them based in Mexico? does that to sort of lessen the threat somewhat?
If we're talking about the threat to the Iranian delegation, I think that, I mean, yeah, of course it does. But I think the bigger reason that they're doing that is because I think the United States is more concerned about threats inside the United States being longer as the team is in the traveling because of, you know, all of the kind of elements that, again, you like you mentioned, we're at war with Iran. So Iran has a robust proxy arm, they have their own cyber, operations and things like that. And there's a many number of things across the spectrum of hostilities that the Iranians could do to make a statement or things like that that the United States is concerned about. But as far as the team being in Mexico, um, I think that's important. But at the same time, we have to work diplomatically with the Mexican government to ensure that nothing goes on during the games as a whole, because it adds a whole other element to things if you're talking about the Mexican team being in Tijuana, because the Mexicans in charge of their own security. But I'm pretty sure that the FBI and our law enforcement is working directly with the Mexican law enforcement, with Mexican intelligence to protect them. Because the one thing that the United States wants to avoid is an embarrassment of the games, no matter where it happens, right? And that embarrassment could be obviously a physical attack, which would be a horrible thing on many levels. Embarrassment might be lower on the list, but it's still something that I think they think about.
Is it just as simple as just more manpower, more people, you know, looking after their buses and coaches and training grounds, or is it more that it's the plans in place are far more detailed than say for any other normal team like England when they're traveling around, or the US? Is it manpower? Or is it more detail, or is it a bit of both?
I mean, the manpower definitely you need that, but I think it's the planning is the key to everything. I mean, we don't get involved in a high stakes security operation without extensive logistics and extensive planning. And again, this isn't just one or two agencies kind of doing this. There are these working groups that are specifically looking at issues that might happen with the Iranian team. And this is again a whole of government approach. This is something that has been going on for a really long time, well before the war started, and probably changed once the war began. And I do think that they are looking at all contingencies, and they're looking just beyond the team in the hotel and the buses. They're looking at bigger picture, because they're looking at what can happen elsewhere. They looking is somebody going to go rogue in the Iranian world and try to mess with them or something like that. Again, there's dissident groups. There's lone wolves in America. There's any number of factors you can think of, particularly when we're talking about international security with a hostile entity that is coming to play games in your own country. I mean, these are all the things they need to look at, because the United States definitely has a huge importance in showing that we can keep anybody safe, including a national team that we are not friendly with their government. But also at the same time, there's other issues that we're looking at. What about if members of the national team might be thinking about defecting? We have to have a contingency for that. And then we can have a contingency. So what happens if that scenario occurs? What are the Iranians going to do? All within our own borders, right? So there could be like a spiraling effect, right? Like if somebody defects, we accept them. The Iranians might retaliate for that. In the United States, there's so many things that need to be thought through that don't really come up if you're just talking in a very general, oh, how do we protect them? It's very layered and very detail oriented.
And I guess those talks between the governments were probably strained. I would have thought they're not easy conversations to have. I guess with so much else going on, I guess is that a reason why maybe Mexico were also brought in as a kind of third party buffer, so to speak.
I think that's definitely a big part of it. A lot of the talks we have are between the committees, the sports committees in the United States and Mexico and Iran. But yeah, you're that's a great point, Steve, is that we need to have, again, this whole conversation going. We need to know what the Iranians are doing. We're, for the United States' part, we're actually limiting the number of Iranians that can come with their delegation. So that puts the onus more on the Mexican government and the United States government, and to some degree the Canadians, even though it's, they're not, just because they're part of the games. But that's the main thing with that for sure.
Yeah, and what's the main threat? Do you think? You mentioned like dissident groups. Obviously, the drone issue is something that we spoke to Andrew Giuliani about, and the federal gut funding has helped sort of improve drone tracking and drone protection, and all this kind of thing. Is that what you're away from the distant groups? Is that something that's kind of concerning, like drone attacks on the Iranian base, or
I think it's you're gonna be I think the bigger one's probably gonna be cyber attacks that we really got to look out for. I mean drones, yes, but I think there's so many layers upon layers of protections in both Mexico and the United States that I think we probably have a really good handle on that. Of course, you can never protect 100%, but we've been doing this a long time. I've worked on drones, for the Department of Justice and things like that. Um, and it's always an issue, but there's so many whole of government approaches between the military, law enforcement, intelligence agencies. When you're talking about Mexico, that I think we have a good handle on that. Although again, not 100%. Drones are a huge concern, but you also have to look at the cyber attacks. A cyber attack can, whether it's from again a dissident group, it could be someone that's anti-Iran for whatever. It could be a women's group, like women's freedom. It could be like anything like that, and then you have the cyber attacks, which can shut down critical infrastructure in the area, whether it's Mexico or LA or Seattle. Um, it could be as much as it's just a political hack, where they kind of just, like spray paint, put mark, like deface a website or something like that. But it also could be something with, again, infrastructure. It can mess up the logistics. Because I think the bigger thing to worry about beyond like the personal security is how can someone that might be intent on disrupting the Iranian team's actions and operations in the United States and Mexico, how can they disrupt that? And, it could be a nuisance or it could be hey, they can't get their bus over, or get on an airplane or whatever it is because we're shutting things down and causing things that way. So I think cyber is the one that we really got to look out for beyond all the other obvious ones like drones and physical security.
I mean, we're talking completely hypotheticals here, but how would a cyber attack manifest? Are you saying that would come from the US side, from kind of separatist group, right wing activists? I mean, what would be your kind of fears on that?
So I think the fear is so let's talk about Russia for a second. Russia is and North Korea are well known for doing what's called false flag operations, where they try to do one of these kind of things where they want us to point the fingers at somebody else and make it really confusing. So something we got to watch out for it because again, the United States in the World Cup is the biggest sporting event in the world, right up there with the Olympics, everything like that. So there are a lot of enemies in the United States that might not have an axe to grind against Iran, but they might use that to embarrass the United States by using Iran as a cudgel against the United States. So what they would do is they would use the state-sponsored, hacker groups, cyber network operation groups, and they would, you know, do something that ties it to the Iran war because again, the Iran war obviously is largely unpopular both in the United States and elsewhere. So they might use that as a further embarrass the United States, and then also embarrass the United States that can't control protect its infrastructure. So what could happen is that some kind of outside group would, mask where it's coming from. It probably would not be coming from inside the United States. It'd be, they call them hop points. It'll hop from around the world in various virtual private networks that we make it hard to trace. There'd be a lot of misinformation about what the purpose is, for what they're trying to do. And I think what a cyber attack would do, it would not cross the threshold into armed conflict. Because one thing about cyber attacks are that a lot of nations like to use them against their adversaries is because cyber operations, unless they physically and directly breaks property or kills somebody, it does not cross the threshold of being an armed attack, which means you can get away with a lot more. And I think that's the way where you can embarrass the United States, cause a little bit of disruption, and then call it a day and blame it on the Iran war.
So like they would take down like a airline website, or I mean, just I know again, complete hypotheticals here, but if someone was willing to do that, how would they do that? What would they potentially look at doing?
Yeah, that's a great question, Steve. And defacing websites is always something. They can deface the FIFA website, for example, or the United States team, the World Cup team websites, or whatever the committee website is in the United States. But they can also escalate it. The Russians, they attacked Estonia's financial markets, several years ago. They could maybe target banking in, say, LA. I think, if you're talking about a false flag or something like that, they can maybe target, like a supporters of Iran or something like that, or even someone that wants to muddy the waters can attack Jewish targets, for example, in LA or Seattle. There's a lot of escalation that goes on. The easiest one is probably the defacing a website that causes embarrassment, but doesn't really break anything. It's more of just an embarrassment. But if they're in, they can disrupt logistics, maybe at the airport, where if we're targeting the Iranian team, somebody committing a cyber attack and cause delays of the flights. And again, this is the World Cup. The games are all over the countries, and disrupting flights around that time, disrupting hotels, which makes it hard to check in people, or disrupting things that are related to security. There's a lot of ways to go about doing this that don't escalate to an armed attack.
And then moving on, adding to that. So like the US is kind of protocols in dealing with those kind of situations, I guess they're amped up even more now in this scenario, right? Like, is that how much more surveillance and vigilance are they having to do in light of what potentially could or could not happen? But it's another layer, isn't it, of vigilance, I guess, and surveillance.
Yes, absolutely. There's the planning goes in, and then once the World Cup is starting to ramp up, the vigilance will just only get, to the highest level possible, and they will monitor everything. There will be a lot of intelligence sharing between law enforcement, the intelligence community, the military, and the governments that are involved. I'm sure that there's high-level conversations with corporations, again, the hotels, the airlines, anybody, but obviously FIFA and everybody like that. So there's definitely going to be ramped up.
It's an extra headache, isn't it? I mean, there's a lot going on, obviously, and like we said, there's a $650 million federal grant to aid security, but this is another. It's unfortunate. No one wants to be at war, but this is another layer of kind of not inconvenience, but it's another layer of difficulty, isn't it?
Well, the Iran war adds such a larger and more complex and complicated layer to everything, because an attack, whether it's a cyber attack or an attack from supporters of Iran, it could be Iranian proxies, it could be false flag operations where Russia or North Korea or any number one of our adversaries wants to embarrass the United States. It could be a dissident group, it could be a hacker group, it could be lone wolves are involved in this one. Any number of scenario, and there's so many ways it can come from, especially when it's amped up. I'm pretty sure that Jewish places are definitely amped up as well. So I think the Jewish community is working with the government and everybody else on this. Recently, there was an arrest of an Iranian proxy group member for planning to target Jewish groups and organizations. We got to worry. The United States has to worry about what the Iranians are going to do, what the Iranian proxies might do, what Iranian supporters, what anti-Israel groups, anti-Jewish groups, and then again, people that are anti-Iran, as you've mentioned. So there's so much more complex, and it's coming from so many worse. You got to not only worry about the lone wolf, because you got to look at. I was talking about cyber before, but you have to also look at what has been the tactic that has been used at a lot of these, big ticket games like the Olympics and things like that. Cyber attacks are always happening. The Russians, for example, have hit every Olympics in the modern times except for the one in Beijing with cyber attacks. So we got to look out for that. While the games themselves are probably secure, like both from the air with drones as well as inside the stadiums, you have to look at other places, soft targets, maybe in the line to get in, at watch parties, any other thing. It could be groups that support the Iranian team. They could have a watch party. That could be something that really needs to be on the radar.
I mean, you mentioned 72 in Munich. I mean, we weren't having these discussions about cyber. Was it?
Right.
But was it more simple? Was it simpler in those days just to be able to sort of combat the threat from outside? You were only really worried about dissidents coming in and attacking. And unfortunately, they had success in 72. But this is different. I know it's 50 years ago, but it's a completely different sort of scenario now, right?
I mean, you're dealing with adversaries, and adversaries are always going to do what they need to do, and they're going to adapt. I mean, obviously, the technology wasn't there back in 72, but what you're looking at then was a coordinated attack by a group that really wanted to get as many eyeballs on their issue as possible. And that's what you got to look out for here is whether it's cyber now, or whether it's a drone attack, or whether it's firearms, or more of a traditional coordinated terrorist attack. You have adversaries from whoever they support that could use the biggest televised event and the biggest sporting event of the year, the World Cup, to kind of advertise whatever their grievance is. I mean, there are terrorist groups in Africa right now. There's a group called JNIM. That is, they could decide. They've been on the march through Mali, through Burkina Faso, Benin, Niger, things like that. If they chose, for example, that this is wanted to be their coming out party for their grievances, they're an Al Qaeda offshoot. This could be it. Same thing with a big time cyber attack or anything like that.
So I have to look up about the cyber attacks from the Russians in the Olympics. Were they generally successful?
To some degree, I mean, Paris was the biggest target of, for all of these kind of things. But yeah, the Russians, they worked on defacement and things like that, and kind of, I think it didn't make a huge impact, obviously. But the Russian cyber attacks were definitely there. They were doing things just to make themselves known, maybe to disrupt a little bit because they want to embarrass a country like at the time France as much as they can. And now, with things going on with Ukraine, kind of grinding on, and the United States kind of had this sometimes where diplomacy, but it's not, you know, coming to any results that Russia can live with right now. Maybe Russia wants to kind of, stick us in the eye a little bit, or the United States in the eye a little bit. And the Iran war is kind of a good kind of way to frame it because it's not that popular around the world.
Sure, sure. It's just fun. Also, I mean, the LAPD is saying it's one of their biggest deployments in decades for like the fan festivals, like the fan events that they're having, across it. That's another, like you just mentioned before, about an Iranian watch party and stuff like that. That's also a kind of potential recipe. We're hoping nothing happens, but those open air fan fests, obviously the security there again is going to be has to be really on point, isn't it?
It does, exactly. Security, I mean, like I said, security needs to be tight. They need to know what's going on. They need to know where the watch parties are at. But another area that we need to look at again, and I hate to keep going back to the cyber part of it, but we need to know what kind of incitement is going on online. Because what you can have is you can have an Iranian watch party, for example, and then there's be some kind of, group with an ulterior motive, and they could use the internet to incite violence against those watch parties, or they can incite violence against maybe Shia, mosques or something like that, or any places of worship, where Iranians, there's a big Iranian presence in Los Angeles, for example. So there are any number of targets, whether it's watch parties or religious or institutions or organizations that so when you're talking about security, it has to be looking online for the incitement part of it, because that's something where a group, if they do it right, can mobilize, an anti-Iran, attack in pretty quick order. They just need to get one lone wolf out there to kind of jump on board with the message and go in and cause an attack.
Yeah, and just generally, I mean, I think they're expecting 40,000 people a day at these fan fests. Whether or not that will materialize, it sounds like a lot, but I mean, everyone has to be on their guard. I guess that's what comes now with these huge global events, isn't it?
It is, and unfortunately, that's how the world has evolved. I think we're at a very heightened phase with the Iran war going on, kind of the anti-Israel sentiment out there. This kind of, there's the Russian war going on. The United States' kind of adversarial relationship with China. You never know when North Korea might decide to, kind of pop up and do something to disrupt things. And then, of course, you have terrorist groups, although, Al Qaeda, the bin Laden version is kind of has offshoots. Al Qaeda, again, like I said, is on the march in Africa. ISIS, their modus operandi is still, trying to do propaganda to get some kind of lone wolves out there. So there's a lot, and it is a whole of government um, significant approach to make sure that everybody stays safe for the next few weeks.
Saying these groups must look at these kind of big global events, especially where they're when they're in the US, and use those as a real target.
Oh yes, absolutely, and other factors can come into play. One thing that's in the news, the past several months and even maybe this past year is that AI has lost thousands of agents and analysts. And so they're kind of things that are still there are really having to do multitask. They're doing their counterterrorism, counterintelligence, but they're also doing maybe integration enforcement. So now, particularly the field offices in LA, Seattle, and elsewhere have to focus, drop everything and focus on planning the World Cup throughout the country. Because, the games are all over the country here. So, um, you know, a adversarial entity, whether a terrorist group or a foreign government, might seek to take advantage of, kind of the lower bandwidth that the law enforcement has in this one. So there are a lot of vulnerabilities that they might seek to exploit.
Yes. Okay. Well, I can't wait for the World Cup. So, unfortunately, we're not talking too much about the sport right now. We're talking about a lot of other different things. So, I hope it all works out and comes through okay. Well, that was Eric Lebowitz there talking to the US Sun about the situation with the Iranian soccer team. I think the most important and interesting fact was that, as Michael mentioned, in 1972 at the Munich Olympics, when Israeli team members were murdered, there was no cyber threats back then. But today, in 2026, the cyber threat is huge. And I think Mr. Lebowitz made the point that we can worry about dissident groups and we can worry about violence on the ground, but yet its potential of cyber attacks, whether that's messing with airline timetables or databases or anything to do with electrical power plants or anything protecting the team and around the team, somebody could deface the FIFA website, for example, and just heap embarrassment onto the hosts. And remember, this is the first time ever in World Cup history that a team is going to take on or come to a tournament hosted by someone they're actually at war at. So there's plenty going on, and Mr. Lebowitz gave a great insight into exactly what the Iranian team can expect over the next few weeks here in the United States.